Okay, next verse please, 22 verse 18. 22 verse 18.
I fell into the trance and saw the Lord speaking. Quick, he said to me, leave Jerusalem immediately, because they will not accept your testimony about it.
Okay, same word. So I want you to see that word when it's used in the Greek speaks about immediate action. It doesn't speak about long delays. It's these things are upon you. So face them, understand them, and take the appropriate action. Don't delay. And it's exactly the same word that's used in Revelation chapter 1 verse 1. So this was a revelation of the things which are going to take place quickly. And this is a major warning really for those who want to see that what John was really writing about, first and foremost, were events in the year 2008 and beyond. There are some approaches to the book which seem to suggest this, that when John was writing all of this strange material about beasts and so on and so forth, and harlots and so on, that he was really thinking about the events of 2008, or maybe around about our time, and further on. So who is the Antichrist? Is it Saddam Hussein? Is it Osama bin Laden? Is it George Bush? Or is it some other current world leader? Kissinger? There have been a number of suggestions along the way, as if John were writing about events that were taking place way, way, way off into the future. And verse 1 suggests the opposite, that in fact Jesus is giving to John for the churches a revelation of things that were going to take place very soon relative to their experience. Now this is interesting because if the book was indeed written in the 60s, mid-60s, when there was a great period of persecution, and AD 70 is just around the corner, the destruction of Jerusalem, which was a momentous event predicted in Scripture in Matthew 24. It was an absolutely world-changing event in terms of the unfolding of the kingdom. Then we could expect that a lot of the book is going to be zeroing in on the kind of things that are going to be experienced in connection with that judgment. These are things which would happen within a generation of the people who were actually receiving this, the rise of Rome and so on and so forth. But that does not mean to say that the book does not have principles which are to be understood and applied for 2008 and every other period that the church faces. And if you think about it, this is the way we approach any book of the Bible. You hear sermons on this constantly. So if we're looking at the book of Joshua, for example, or the book of Genesis, we'll be trying to understand it in its context. What did it mean to the people who first heard that? But because we're dealing with a God who's the same yesterday, today and forever, and He doesn't change in terms of His character, if the circumstances are similar at a later age of God's people, then we can legitimately apply the truths of that material to our own day and age. And so, even though the material has immediate relevance for the Christians of the day, that does not mean to say that there aren't principles which we need to understand and apply now. Does that make sense? Questions or comments on that?
No, I have written down a note, Revelation. Emphasis is that God is in control.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And whatever happens.
Yep.
At that time, and also today, tomorrow and whenever.
Absolutely. And that's a major theme of the book that keeps coming through, that God is completely in control. And that being the case, that's a principle which we need to apply to all of the events that we're facing in the world today. When I was growing up and going to high school, one of the big concerns I'm showing my age now, but one of the big concerns was the rise of the communist empire and what was going to happen. We remember that, right? And then suddenly that sort of died down a bit because the Berlin Wall came crashing down and a number of communist countries sort of imploded. But now there's another major thing on the horizon, that's the rise of Islam and the effect of Islam on Western nations. These big world-sweeping powers, you see. Now what I'm going to suggest as we make our way through, that when we find out how God deals with the situation in the first century and the messages of encouragement to His people, they're messages that we can take to heart today and apply in the kind of situations that we face. So the book is extremely comforting and very relevant. And we need to grasp it because it's a great thing when we do. But nonetheless, the people who were reading it, they were reading about a message that they needed to hear immediately because of their circumstances and the persecution and so on. Okay. One last thing to note. These are the things which are signified. Here's where the NIV lets us down a little bit because it doesn't mention this word. But the word is seimino in the Greek, and it indicates things which are shown by way of signs or indications. In other words, they're not necessarily shown literally. In 2 years' time from now, you will experience this, in very literal terms. No, that's not the way the book is constructed. The book is telling what's going to happen using a method of signifying things. That is to not speak so much to be literal, but to speak in terms of pictures and signs. And this is a major interpretive clue in the book, which we picked up on earlier, because it contains a lot of symbols. It's symbolic. Not so much literal, but it's symbolic. It's got pictures in it. It signifies things. So when we get this beast in chapter 13 that rises up out of the sea with many heads and many horns, we're not necessarily to think of the Loch Ness monster, transmogrified into something else. We're to think in terms of symbols and pictures and signs. And there's an interesting theory about this, which I'll just throw out for your interest. Given the fact that this material was written to people who were being persecuted, and under the Romans things were becoming very difficult for them. The Gentiles were making it hard for the Christians. And given the fact that the only way that this material could be taken around the churches was in the form of manuscripts that were delivered, the theory is that this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of symbolism associated with the book. Because any Roman centurion capturing one of these people delivering a manuscript and reading this stuff about beasts coming up, he goes, absolute nonsense, you Christians are around the twist. And he would let it go. But if the book spoke more clearly about the rise of the Roman Empire, what the Caesars were doing, what Nero is doing, and the certainty of the judgment that will come upon them, well, that is treason. And so that's a theory anyway. It's one of the reasons why it was using symbolic language, because there was so much persecution at the time. Questions or comments? So these are some of the interpretive clues that we'll need to use as we make our way through. And just to sort of whet our appetites now, let's see how a bit of this works. Symbols, you see, symbolic language. We're told that there are 7 churches in chapters 2 to 3, 7 churches in Asia Minor.